Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be diving into the world of the unknown, seeking out stories of Wendigos, Skinwalkers, and other cryptids. I hope you're ready, because it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My name is Jennifer, but most people call me Jenny. I am a 25-year-old and live in a relatively small town in Kentucky. Growing up, my mother sometimes had the most random boyfriends. It was while she was dating a guy that lived at a trailer park that these experiences happened. I was about 9 years old when all of this went down. The first experience came about one day when my mom took me and two of my brothers to go visit her boyfriend. The trailer park he lives in was fairly large and surrounded by huge wooded areas. That will be important later. Many people lived there, and someone owned a small poodle breed dog that ran around playing with everyone and loved getting pets from us. His name was Snoopy. Well, one day Snoopy went missing. He never showed up, and that was not normal for him. His owner said he never came home, so a bunch of us got together and began searching for him. We couldn't find him anywhere, and we searched for hours. We'd pretty much given up hope when someone yelled out that they had found something. I remember running over as a crowd gathered at the base of a tree in the backyard of my mum's boyfriend. My mum tried keeping us kids looking back, but it was too late. I saw what it was the people were freaking out over. It was a pile of skin and fur. Dirty white and curly fur. That was just like Snoopy's had been. It was still attached to the skin, and the rest of the body was nowhere to be found. We all stared at it in shock, wondering how this could have happened. As far as we knew, no one would have wanted to hurt the little dog. He was a sweet little thing, and never really bothered anyone except to play. No explanation was really given, and the pile of skin and fur was disposed of. A couple of weeks later, my mum wanted to go see her boyfriend again, and once again, she took me and two of my brothers along. But first, we decided to stop by a friend's who lived in the same trailer park for a few minutes. When we pulled up and got out of the car, I noticed a little black cat. I love animals, so I went over to pet it before going into the friend's house. We were in there for around 10 or 15 minutes and left. While walking back to the car, something caught my eye. Something glistened under the streetlight. It was nighttime, so they were on, and as I approached it, out of curiosity, I was surprised to find the body of a small cat. It was the same size of the cat I had just petted only minutes before. The only issue was that the body had no skin. None. It was bone, meat and muscle, but all the skin and fur had been removed. It was still wet, and emitted some warmth as if it were fresh. I pointed it out to my mum, and she was grossed out, but didn't really make anything of it, and told me to leave it alone and get into the car. Snoopy came to my mind though. I thought it was odd that two animals had now been skinned, with no explanation. As the days pass, I put the animals in the back of my mind. We kept visiting my mum's boyfriend and hanging out with the neighborhood kids. Other non-related odd things happened, like there was the time my oldest brother and I found a Pennywise clown suit nailed to a tree in the woods. But that's a story for another time. For me, the scariest thing happened one day, when my little brother and I were laying outside on a picnic table one afternoon in the backyard of my mum's boyfriend. As we lay there, my little brother decided to take a nap. I wasn't really sleepy, so I just looked at the clouds and surveyed the surrounding area. The backyard was quite large. There was a large area of woods back there, and a huge field that belonged to a neighbour. Only a thin, rusted wire fence separated the field from the backyard. It was in the field that I saw something in the distance that wasn't there before. A figure standing there. At first glance I thought it was a man, but it didn't move at all. Then it seemed to notice me watching it, and it did move. It began going forwards. I noticed that it was oddly postured. The right shoulder dipped lower than the left, and its gait was a bit unsteady. As it got closer, I saw more details. It was at least 6 foot tall, perhaps more, and what I had thought was clothing now looked like rags from a distance off the figure. Its arms were longer than a human should be, and the hands looked bigger and possibly clawed. I quickly realized this was not a man I was looking at. My eyes widened, and I shook my little brother awake, pointing the figure and asking, "Do you see that?" He looked towards the figure, and his eyes also widened as he nodded. I looked back and realized in horror that the thing had gotten even closer. From what I could see, it had no nose. It had what looked to be nostrils on its face, kind of how it would look like if you cut the nose off a human. Its eyes were pitch black, and it had one arm outstretched, reaching towards us. I looked back at my brother and said that we should run. We both leapt off the table and ran so fast we would have given the Flash a run for his money. We ran towards the trailer, but didn't even make it out of the backyard before that thing let out a scream. It's hard to describe something that sounded like a roar mixed with nails on a chalkboard. It was terrifying, and neither of us looked back to see if it was any closer. We bolted inside, and of course told my mother, but she didn't really react, beyond figuring we were just imagining things. Naturally, but we refused to go back outside. My mum broke up with her boyfriend not long after that, so we never had a chance to go back to that trailer park. I'm glad. Something tells me that the thing my little brother and I saw was responsible for those skinned animals. Those woods surrounded the whole area of the trailer park, and I figure that that's where it lives and how it travels. I recently asked my brother if he remembered the incident, and his response was, "I sure do." What the hell even was that thing? We spoke about it, and had a few theories, but we're still not really sure. A Skinwalker? A Wendigo? All I know is I'm glad we ran. There's no telling what would have happened if we'd have stayed on that table and the creature caught up to us. I was a kid when this happened. My uncle and I were finishing up chopping and gathering firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark. Driving back onto a dirt road at about 30 miles an hour, I had this awful sense of being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't!" I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out my chest, and then completely stopped when I heard a tap on my window. My uncle sped up and was loudly praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on and thought it was all over until our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me! Don't turn away," over and over. And then I heard it again. Tap, tap, up from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe, and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed, and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around and sighed. It was quiet, besides the truck on the road. He looked at me and said, We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning, so the evil will forget our faces. I remember curling up on the seat and just staring at the radio, watching the time, listening to my uncle sing an old prayer until we arrived at my grandmother's house. I actually called my uncle after, because I had a nightmare about that night. We talked about it for a bit, and he just said, "I didn't see faces, just eyes, like brake lights you see on the road. It watched you." Before hanging up, I tried to joke with him about it. "Why didn't you just step on the brake when it was in the back?" There was no laughter, just a pause, because it wasn't alone. For a short time, I lived in a small rural town in New Mexico. Living in this small town, my dad found a lot of odd handman jobs, and one of the main jobs was cutting and gathering firewood for a local general store. Having to drive deep into heavily wooded areas to cut and collect firewood was not an easy task for most trucks. My dad drove a large, lifted 1980s Dodge Ram truck. The front of the grille also had a heavy metal rack to be able to winch ourselves out of sticky situations and ram through anything else. No pun intended. This thing was a beast. The kind that has a big red switch to select what gas tank you wanted to drink from to drive this thing. One late evening, right before sundown, we were driving home in between two very small towns. The road in between them was very heavily wooded on either side. When out on the left side of the truck, something big, grey and hairy darted as fast as I've ever seen anything move across the road. We just missed the middle of whatever this monster was, and it must have clipped it, and clipped it hard. My dad almost lost control and rolled the truck. Coming to a stop on the side of the road, we both jumped out and tried to see what exactly we hit, but nothing was there. The only thing we found was blood and the bent rack of his truck. The scary thing is that this thing seemed to be almost like a wolf-shaped creature. And the even worse thing is that we were able to see the top of whatever this thing was over the hood of the truck, with a roughly 2 to 3 inch lift. After a couple of minutes, both my dad and I got a very eerie feeling in the area, so we ran back into the truck. My dad drawing his gun from under his seat, just in case. We both drove back the long dark road home in silence. When we got home, we didn't even empty the truck. We just ran in and locked the doors. Both of us have a strange feeling about what went down. Still, to this day that road gives me the creeps. I moved far away from those small towns and back to a more familiar location. This took place about 6 or 7 months ago. My friends and I wanted to celebrate my other friend's high school graduation and first year of college, so we decided that we would take a trip out to another friend's hunting shack in the middle of the woods. We were all of age and well into our 20s, but the friend we were celebrating was not, so we needed to be careful. My friend Jason and I brought beer and other party favors for the night. We arrived and brought everything in for the night. Now, some of the other people that were going to be partying with us were running a little late, so it was just me, Brandon, and my other friend Jason. We decided to go for a quick walk while we waited for Wetson, the graduate, and Andrew. They said that they were about an hour away, so we had some time to kill before they arrived, and were going to show the others the party favors. Now, The shack was on a half-mile long dirt road, with 2 or 3 other deer shacks on it. Ours, of course, was the last one before the dead end sign, but it sat on 40 acres of land. About 20 feet behind the shack was a cliff that dropped off about 20 feet into thick forest, where we would hunt. Usually when we go, there's no one around for miles, so I always bring my gun just in case we have an emergency. Now, I know a lot of people say that you can scare off most animals with loud sounds or standing your ground, but what if it doesn't work? I like having that final option if it comes down to it, and I'd rather fight for my life than run for it. I strapped on my old trusty 9mm, and we went out on our merry way. It was around 5 or 6 o'clock, and it was summertime, so still relatively bright outside. It was somewhere between 75 to 80 Fahrenheit, and very humid, but there was a clear sky. We made our way to the end of the road, and turned to make our way back to the cabin. On our way, we noticed something a bit odd. As we were looking for sticks and other tinder to get a fire going, we saw severed deer legs. It looked as though they had been ripped off the deer and thrown onto the side of the road. It looked a day or so old, so we didn't worry as there was no immediate threat. Eventually we saw across the road and figured out that the deers had been bedding down in the tall grass and were ambushed by coyotes or wolves. But my friend Jason pointed out 3 or 4 other deer bodies around the area that all looked relatively new, but mangled. I don't know about you, but I've never seen a pack of coyotes kill 4 deer and not eat any of it. But what seemed extremely weird is that there seemed to be only one set of coyote tracks, and they were pretty big. But I brushed it off as I was trying to have fun. We made our way back to the shack and shook off what we saw, trying to get hyped for the fun of the night. We smoked a little green, cracked open a few beers, all in good fun, and just as my friend Jason was about to call Wetson, they pulled into the driveway. To give you some additional context, we had all worked in a water park together. Me, Wetson and Andrew were all safety attendants. I even did security for a hotel for a bit, and Brandon and Jason were both lifeguards, and Jason was my supervisor / boss. I actually quit my job from the hotel 4 months prior to this happening, and I moved back to the old town I'm originally from, which was approximately 2 hours away from my friends. Now, I had not seen Andrew and Wetson since then, so it was kind of like a reunion when we saw each other. They jumped out and started bringing stuff into the shack, and saw me right away. My friends Jason and Brandon didn't tell Wetson and Andrew that I was coming, so it was kind of like a surprise. We all greeted each other, and helped bring their shit inside too. Now, this is where the typical party happened. We spoke, we drank, they smoked some green. But my friend Wetson had not done most of this before, so we were breaking his cherry, so to speak. After a small tutorial on how to party like the big boys, he was all well on being on his way in a dimension not of our own. The sun made its way down, and Brandon busted out some mushrooms. Now, I have experienced these before, but I had work the next day, so I decided to just be the trip sitter on this one. Everyone ate their share, and like giddy little kids, they waited for the shrooms to kick in. They asked me how long it would take, as I was more experienced in these kind of things, and I let them know it would be about an hour to 45 minutes. I mostly drank that night, but I took my time as I said before, as I did have work next morning. So I was drinking maybe a beer an hour. I had not planned on being torn up, but boy was I enjoying watching everyone else's descent into madness. Eventually the sun was down, and I was a 6-pack deep into my 12-pack. I needed a piss, and so did everyone else, so we made our way outside. I lit a cigarette and began to do my business. I looked into the starry night and was so amazed at how beautiful it was. I asked everyone else if maybe they wanted to go on a walk with me, and to my surprise, everyone did. Now that I look back on it, this wasn't such a good idea because of their mental impairments, but the shack was hot and it was starting to cool down outside, so I wanted to enjoy the cool breeze. Everyone stumbled together, and I zipped up my pants and joined the group. They wanted me to take the lead, since I was the most sober out of everyone. I went inside, grabbed my flashlight and an extra magazine for my pistol, and we made our way onto the road. My plan was just to make it to the end of the street and come back. Most of my friends were pretty loud, so I knew that if there was anything out there, before long it would be gone. We didn't immediately use the flashlight, as they wanted to see the stars and the moon, so I obliged and turned it off. They were babbling about how intimidating the sky was when I started hearing some low growling and occasional tall grass rustling. I brushed off the growling as one of my friends being stupid or trying to freak everybody out, and I figured the grass rustling could be just a raccoon or a fox. We continued until we came across the deer leg, and I remembered the bodies of the deer we saw earlier. Just then, an immediate sense of sobering danger swept over my body. I felt as though we were not alone anymore. My friends made comments about why we were stopped, and I turned around to tell them to start making our way back, when I noticed what seemed to be the head of a black figure behind a tree swiftly pull itself back from my view. My stomach dropped, and my facial expressions washed away from concern to a pale fear. I slowly reached for my flashlight and pistol. I clicked the light on and began moving towards the figure, when I heard as what I can only describe as the sound of hell itself. A guttural screech, almost as loud as a gunshot, burst through the night air. All of my friends just about shit their pants, but I couldn't hear them as my ears ran like hell. One of them whimpered, and the screeching stopped. I raised my light and my gun to see what looked like a floating deer head on a black, scraggly body staring back at us. Its eyes were plucked out of its sockets, and blood oozed out of it. Its mouth hung agape, with its tongue sticking out at us, almost like it was smiling. I could feel it staring directly at me. It was like a fire was piercing through my eyes and into my soul. I began to tear up a bit. I always knew Skinwalkers existed, but I never thought I'd come face to face with one like this. My friends were silent, as we had a staring contest with this thing. I didn't want to be here anymore, so I started telling them that if anything happened, we needed to run. I kept my eyes on the beast, and slowly started backing out from the way we came. Now, this thing was sort of behind us and off to the right in the ditch when I turned around and saw it, so we needed to make our way around it. We walked to the left side of the road, as far away as possible, and made our way around, but I didn't think that this thing had intentions of letting us leave that easily. As soon as it realized what we were going to do, it started charging at us. I stepped about twice before I began firing at this thing. The gun kicked in my hand, and I could see the muzzle flashes as I pulled the trigger again and again and again. The ringing in my ears was greeted by the loud snapping of gunfire. I spent all 13 rounds of the 9mm and reloaded for another go, but the thing was gone, nowhere to be seen, and had vanished in the blink of an eye. I don't remember shooting most of those rounds, but I believe my instincts took over after the second or third shot. After that, it's all a blur, but I know I emptied the first mag, because I remember grabbing it off the ground and loading the second one. My friends, on the other hand, had bailed as soon as the thing began charging at us, and I started shooting. The figure was tall and had a deer's head, but the body looked weak and meagre. But I knew that it wasn't. I knew that if it had the chance, it would have torn me and my friends apart. I stood in disbelief. My gun's barrel was still pointed where this thing was. The smoke from the gunpowder left the end of my gun, and I turned and started sprinting my ass off into the shack. My friends were all sweaty, and one had began to hyperventilate. I walked into the mess of men and laid down on the bed, gun still in hand. My friend Jason started questioning me. What the hell was that thing? I answered honestly. I told him that it may have been a Skinwalker. He had no idea what that meant. So I explained, and it seemed to make him more curious and have more questions than what I felt comfortable answering while we were still in those woods. I told him to forget about it, but he kept on pushing it. So I told him that just saying the name could potentially attract that thing back. After he learned that, he dropped the subject altogether. I know no one was in any condition to drive, but I knew we couldn't stay where we were in fear of this thing coming back. So me, being the most sober, packed everyone into one car and we headed for Josh's father's house. Packed everyone into one's cars and we headed for Jason's father's home. His father was on vacation, but he lived in a well-populated city, and so we decided that that was the place to be. Besides, it was the closest place to us, only about an hour or so. Shocked and still scared, I put the car into park, looked at him, and asked him if he was going to be alright. He said yeah, but he still had a hard time believing what had just happened. I told him a little more on the subject, and he seemed to relax once I told him that these things are rarely ever seen. But he asked me how I managed to stay so brave during all of this. Little did he know I was probably more scared than anyone, because I knew what this thing was, and what would happen if it found us again. We all made our way inside. His dad's place, and called it a night. The next morning, we all got up early to head back to the shack so that we could grab our stuff, and Wetson still needed to get his car to go home. I dreaded having to go back, but I needed to grab my bag and phone. As we pulled in, we noticed a foul smell, like decaying fish or old food, that sat in a park garbage can for weeks. I knew something was up, so I told everyone to make it fast. They did, and I peeled dirt as we made our way out of there. I never looked back, and I never intend to. I still talk to my friends once in a while, but not as often as before. I feel as though the Skinwalker ruined a little more than just our night, but a good friendship too. I met with a few native friends not too long after this and told them the story. They asked me if I had any native friends with me that night, and I told them no. They asked me if I was native myself, and I told them yes, but very little, as it wasn't very prominent in my family. But then it hit me. That thing stared at me only. Now I know why I felt like fire was burning in my eyes. It wanted me, and only me. They told me I needed a blessing, so I let them do a ritual, and after that, they told me to never go back into those woods again. And to be honest, I never intend to. The weirdest thing I've had happen to me was a full-blown cryptid encounter out in the Joshua Tree. I'll preface this by explaining a bit about myself. I have always been a night owl, and my current profession actually entails being up all night, so the dark doesn't bug me. And I have pretty good night vision. I don't panic. I am a medical professional, and a bit of an outdoorsman. I'm a relatively big dude, 6'2", 260 pounds, and a biology nerd. The first encounter I had was on October 22nd, 2005, on a stretch of back road in the Mojave Desert, in the vicinity of Joshua Tree and Yucca Valley. It was the third or so day of quail season, and I was all tagged up and ready to go hunting. I had a little Jack Russell Terrier named Gus that the friend let me borrow for the day, since I don't own dogs or cats. I drove out and parked my Jeep on a turnout point on a dirt road intersection. There are zillions of dirt roads out here, and some of the bigger ones actually have stop signs at the intersections. It was a good day and getting a little late, but I hadn't hit my bag limit yet, and I decided I would stay a bit past sundown to try and bag the last few birds on my permit. I was dressed pretty warmly, and Gus didn't seem to mind, so away we went. By the time I hit my bag limit, the sun had been over the horizon for about an hour. Getting back to the road was easy enough, and following it back to the Jeep was as well. Around the time full twilight set in, I came to an intersection with stop signs on both directions, and was getting my bearings when Gus froze mid-air and immediately started growling with his hackles up. He was a pretty chill dog, so watching him go from happy little derp to DEFCON 1 so fast was alarming on its own. I scanned the area to see what he might be upset about, because my first guess was javelina, wild pigs, and all I had was a shotgun loaded with bird rounds. As I said, these were dirt roads. Each road is roughly the same width as an average 2-lane city street. On the corner, opposite the one I was on, I spotted a creature moving in the same general gait as a rooster, but without bobbing its head. What clued me in initially that it wasn't a chicken was the simple fact that from head to foot it must have been close to about 3 feet tall, based on body mass. I'd estimate that it weighed about 40 to 50 pounds. I tied Gus's leash to my belt so he wouldn't bolt off and waited for it to wander off. I loitered off in the corner for a minute, then without making so much as a flutter, it made a roughly 9-foot standing leap from the ground to perch atop a stop sign. Definitely not a chicken. At this point I decided it was prudent to be armed, so I popped 2 fresh shells in my shotgun and held it at the ready. When I looked back up, I saw its eyes. 2 things immediately sprang to mind. This is where the biology geek comes in. 1, they were facing forwards, meaning this animal was likely predatory. And 2, they were proportionally enormous, meaning it was likely full nocturnal. I realized that a 3-foot predatory nocturnal 40-pound animal like that can make a 9-foot standing leap was now in front of me on a high perch, albeit roughly 40 feet away, and that I was in a bad position. I leveled my shotgun and unloaded both barrels at it. After the echoes died down, it was still perched atop of the sign, making a strange noise that almost sounded like sneezing. I was reloading when it jumped down from the stop sign and ran away from us through the brush onto the adjacent corner. I finished reloading, waiting for Gus to calm down, and jogged back to the Jeep. On the way back through, I hit my trail light at the intersection that this happened at, and saw that the stop sign had definitely been peppered with the shot, and that the majority of it had been centered on the animal. This animal had taken a 9-foot standing leap soundlessly, perched perfectly on a 2-inch square area, and taken 2 12-gauge loads of birdshot, center mass, and sneezed at me. On the way out of town, I told the story to the Spanish-speaking clerk at a little gas station, who laughed and told his co-worker, "You hear that? Looks like Güero just ran into the chupacabra." Needless to say, my encounter left me relatively frightened. The aftermath, though, is certainly worth talking about. I do need to share a little bit more background, though. I am a sleep tech. I monitor for and treat sleep apnea and a wide range of other sleep issues like parasomnias and narcolepsy. A big part of my job is being able to work a complete 10 to 12 hour graveyard shift while remaining alert and taking detailed notes on the behavior of my patients. Sometimes if a patient is disabled and doesn't have reliable transportation, we do in-home studies, meaning we get to drag a big suitcase full of monitoring equipment to someone's house to run the study, rather than then coming to the lab. When this happens, it's a mixed bag, because they send 2 techs out for security purposes, and we're both paid at the same rate as we would be for multiple patients to sit and just monitor one. The downside is that we have to sit in someone's filthy ass house all night. There are exceptions, of course, where people not only keep their homes clean, but actually treat their techs like honored guests. The first time I ever did a home study was at a ride-along with a senior tech to do a patient that lived way out in the desert. Obviously I can't say where due to confidentiality issues, but suffice to say it was at least an hour's drive each way to the patient's residence from our lab. The night started nicely enough. On arrival, we realized that these weren't weirdos we were dealing with. They were just nice people that enjoyed rural living and the quiet that living that far in the desert afforded. They had a well and pumped for water, chicken coops, livestock, and a garden set up, and were doing incredibly well for how bleak the surrounding landscape was. The patient and their family were all waiting for us and asked if we'd eaten yet. We were treated very well, a nice spread of home-cooked Mexican food, and after the patient was prepped for the study and in bed, we settled on the couch with the monitoring equipment and got to work at about 9. The next few hours were very uneventful, until the motion light adjacent to the house started going off at random. Each time it would trigger, I'd go to the blinds to look outside, only to be treated to the breathtaking view of the patient's driveway. This happened 3 times, before I asked my co-worker to take over monitoring, and took a seat at the window with the blind slits just slightly open, hoping to catch what was tripping the motion light. After 2 hours, I saw it. I was just about to give up when the light tripped, and I instantly scanned the front yard from left to right. On the block wall at the very end of the driveway, I barely caught something moving along the base of the wall, away from the garden and chicken coops. It was the very spitting image of the thing that I'd seen several years prior. About 3 foot tall, walking bipedally, and with the same general gait as a very large chicken. Without taking my eyes off it, I whispered and motioned to my co-worker to get her ass over here and tell me I'm not crazy. She comes to the blinds, looks out, and went shock still when I guided her to where to look. She relaxed visibly and said, "It's just a chicken," until I reminded her that the wall was close to 5 feet tall, and the creature we were looking at was easily more than half its height. We watched it creep, from one side of the wall to the entrance at the driveway, and then scramble through the iron gate that closed the driveway in. We went to the front and back doors of the house and checked to make sure they were locked. They were, and spent the rest of the time alternating monitor duty, while the other kept a post next to the window, watching for anything else. In the morning, we woke our patient as normal, packed equipment up, and went to pack the car, when one of the family members quietly asked us if we'd seen anything strange last night. I told him that the motion lights had been going off, and we saw a strange animal that I described in detail walking along the front wall that squeezed through the gate. He asked me if I knew what it was. My coworker shook her head and I said, "Yeah, I have seen that thing before. I think I saw something like it when I was hunting a few years prior," and told them both the story of my first encounter. The coworker looked at me like a loon. The family member nodded and said that my first run-in was a close one and that I was lucky I had a gun. Turns out that overnight they lost 4 chickens, which they found still in the coop, apparently unharmed, save that they were drained of blood and stiff as rocks. We said goodbye to our patient and their family and started to drive back to the lab. While we were cleaning the equipment, she asks me if my story was true, and I said to her that it was. She asked me if it was something that we should report to the police, and I told her it was best to leave that up to the patient and their family, and if asked to give our account, we would. She asked what the hell it was that we'd seen, so I texted her a Google search link, and after reading a few articles, she stood and stared at me for a minute, finished packing her things, and went home. We never spoke about it again, save for the odd knowing glance when a patient would ask, "What's the weirdest thing you've seen on the job?" She wound up leaving the company a few months later for greener pastures, and that specific company would end up going under just a few years later for various reasons, and I haven't spoken with her since. This story happened to me around June or July of 2007. I was roughly 17 years old, and a lot more cocky back then than I am now, but still somewhat knowledgeable of the outdoors. My family used to own a cabin in northwest Wisconsin. I basically grew up there in the summer. I knew the woods well, but at night it was wise to stay in the cabin, or at least by the bonfires on the beach, because of bears, wolves, and cougars. One of the creepiest things that, if you were having a bonfire, the tree line was visible from the fire pit and beach. And at night, you always felt like you were being watched from that tree line. But during the day, the woods always seemed normal. Not so creepy. That is, of course, until this incident. So this happened somewhere between midday and 2 o'clock. Me and my cousin were having an airsoft battle. So I was in full woodland camo. He was not. I retreated onto the ATV trail, into the woods for a tactical advantage, and our battle took us around 200 meters into about a third of the way up of the trail. We'd had enough at this point, and were standing at the edge of a clearing on the trail, talking, and he was maybe 10 feet from me. When I decided to mess with him, I shushed him and said, "We're being watched." He froze, and then I realized the woods were dead quiet, and I got spooked, and started scanning the tree line and the other edge of the clearing from left to right. That's when I saw it. Its teeth gave it away. It was panting and staring at my cousin. I don't expect you to believe me, but what I saw was a wolf as big as a black bear, at least 300 pounds. But it wasn't normal. This wolf was on 2 legs, crouching next to the tree, with its arm grasping the tree. grasping with a clawed hand. It had reddish-brown fur, and I told my cousin that we have to go. And next thing I know, he is sprinting, and I look back at Wolfie, who was locked on and sprinted a few steps on 2 feet. I then turned and ran, when it looked like Wolfie was dropping to all fours. It charged at us, and sounded right on our asses barreling through the bush, but for whatever reason, let us go when we broke out of the tree line, and headed for the cabin. What stuck with me the most was the sheer size. Wolfie appeared to be nearly 7 feet tall, when upright, and where it should have had front paws, it appeared to have large clawed hands. Now I'm not going to explain it away rationally. I've heard wolves will occasionally walk upright, but as far as I know, they can't sprint on 2 legs, nor do wolves get that big, and black bears more waddle on 2 legs. The closest description is silly. A wolfman, dogman, skinwalker, or wendigo. Take your pick. But I know what I saw that day, and I know where I won't be returning to. I've struggled with this story for years, mostly because I just could not believe what I saw. You don't have to believe me, folks, but good Lord, do I know what I saw. I was camping with my Boy Scout troop in Alpine, New Jersey, when I was in early 8th grade. I stepped out of the cabin in the middle of the night to take a piss, and went out to do my business. I stood outside for a second, taking in the campsite. I was standing by a picnic table and glanced around. The moon was so bright that it made the sky look dark blue rather than black, and there was a light fog ominously cascading along the campsite. I heard a rustle in some bushes, and didn't think much of it at first, but it continued and got louder. Slowly, I moved my flashlight along, until I got to the source of the noise as it got louder and louder. I looked over and saw something that I still don't quite understand. This thing was gigantic. Standing on hind legs, he was tall and had a muscular body, with fur that looked to be black/dark grey. He had the head of a dog or wolf, only thicker, and the weirdest part, yellow eyes. I stared at him, and he stared at me, and then he just vanished. He ran away faster than I could even blink. I was so bewildered that I blacked out for a minute, and had to sit down, but I went back to the cabin and tried to get some sleep. I managed to block it out of my mind for a while, but eventually it resurfaced when I watched an episode of Monster Quest about werewolves. This doesn't really bother me anymore. Truthfully, I actually thought it was pretty damn cool. Almost like the setting for a perfect horror movie. The funny thing is, I feel like this thing didn't want me to see him any more than I wanted to see it. It was as if we looked at each other and silently agreed to say nothing, leave each other alone, and then act like this never happened. I personally don't buy into the whole transformation bark at the moon bullshit. I think werewolves are more of an undiscovered species. I stayed with the troop for a while, after making Eagle to help mentor some younger scouts. And while I'll always be known as the fun leader, probably due to being close in age, I still always stress to them that the buddy system is mandatory at all times, because my night could have been much different if this strange creature I saw was a little more on the confrontational side. I was in the army, back in Desert Storm days. I was an 11B2H trainer, and would go TDY, detached duty, across the country to train units up for deployment. 7 of the guys in my unit got tabbed to go run for Orpfall against some Marines and Navy personnel who were setting up a field hospital. The place is populated now, but it was an old World War I post and pretty much out in the sticks at the time. The scenario was the Navy sets up. The Marines provide security and try to stop us from getting inside. We want to keep them up all night, so we probe around and make noise. At around 2 a.m, we're ready to infiltrate. The Marines have set up a bunch of OPs along a ridge, and my job is to divert their attention while one element makes its way through some serious thickets, and another just crawls right up to their lines. We were a little short-handed, so I go on my own. I start at the base of the ridge and make my way up. I'm known for being a sneaky and silent mofo, and they don't notice me. There's all kinds of forest debris on the ground, so it's really slow going. I'm about 3/4 of the way up when I hear it. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I think it's one of the Marines, and I've blown the approach, so I freeze. Then it goes again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. And then again. I'm thinking, what the hell? It goes on like this for about 5 minutes, repeating every 20 seconds or so. It's pitch black, but it sounds really close. Then it shifts position, and I can hear leaves and twigs crackling. It sounds huge, and it's about 6 feet away. I think, oh shit, it's a ball, and drop my A2 with its blanks and miles gear and pull out my machete. It hears me, and boom, it stands up, more like leaps up. It was so fast. All I could see was a dark shape about 7 feet tall. Screw noise discipline. I yell, "Hey!" and it takes off running, heading off to the top of the ridge. I lose sight of the shape pretty quickly, but the Marines OP see it and open fire. I slide on my ass back down the hill and hightail it back to the rally point. I have to wait, alone, for about 3 hours before everyone makes it back. I figure the noise I had heard was a deer or a boar rubbing its antlers or tusks against a tree, but it was far too big to be a boar, so I told myself it was a deer. We get to the after-action review at about 7 a.m, and the Marines OPs swear it was a big dude running across the lime ridge. The captain makes me stand up to see if it was me, but they're all saying nah, he's way too small. They had night vision and swear up and down it wasn't a deer, but something else, bipedal, which they could not identify. I pocketed some live .223 gear every time out there after that. I've grown up in Northwest Florida, bordering Alabama my whole life. Growing up out here, you learn the dangers of the woods, though it's mostly safe in the daytime due to a lack in bear population around my area. Most of them were hunted and killed long ago, at least in our local farming community. Still, you might get bitten by numerous types of venomous snakes, or mauled and eaten in 30 seconds by wild hogs. In the nighttime, you can hear hundreds of coyote packs yelping and howling. The coyotes here range from deer size, being coloured tan and grey, to pure black, with pointed ears, and being about the size of a German shepherd. So yeah, they're no joke. And during the hurricanes at night, you could hear panthers screaming through the woods. My house is completely surrounded by deep woods, and filled with thick brush, making it difficult to traverse through. Right next to my house is my uncle, and then, next to him, was a lady who had been known to raise hundreds of cats, and at the time of this story, Also had a black Labrador with beautiful lab/beagle mixed puppies. This is important to the story. But other than that, on the other side of my house, front and back, there was nothing but trees for miles. I was going through a bout of depression while working KFC. I won't specify why I was depressed, but I basically dealt with it by smoking some good tweed while hanging out with my 87 LS Monte Carlo. Oftentimes, the puppies would run up to my car when they'd smell me smoking, and would want me to come with them. One in particular, which was the runt of the litter, would just hop into my car with me, and I would express my feelings to it. I took a particular liking to this puppy, and every day I would look forward to playing with it, as it made me feel better. One night, I pulled up to my house after a long night at work, covered in chicken blood and flour, ready to take a shower, when I step out of my car, and I hear the whimpering and whining of a puppy. It sounded like it was deep in the woods. Not even thinking for a second, even though I never dared to before, I sprinted, with nothing to protect myself, deep into the woods behind my house. I had to save this puppy. It was all I could think about, as the adrenaline filled my body. When I got close to where I thought the puppy was, I could hear something rustling around, and then the whining just stopped. I noticed that there were no sounds around me at all, just pitch black and silence. At this point, I wasn't aware that the woods got silent if predators were around, as I didn't really listen to scary stories yet. I heard the whimper again, from a short distance, and still pumping with adrenaline, I head towards it. Having got to where I thought I was, I then heard it again, but this time, in a completely different place. So I ran towards the sound again. I hear it again, only this time it's really close. All of a sudden, I get a chill down my spine, and a feeling that something has its eyes on me. I decided to book it out of there, because of this ominous feeling, and I could hear something behind me as I ran faster than I ever had back to my house. The next day, I realized that all the puppies were accounted for, so I completely brushed off the incident, figuring I just heard a coyote pup or something. Yeah, that doesn't make much sense. Fast forward 4 years in the future, and I start hearing the stories of skinwalkers and wendigos mimicking voices of people, pets, and other things. I wonder if I was almost a late-night snack. I mean, there's an old overgrown Native American burial ground about a mile into the woods by my house. But anyway, nowadays, I never turn my back to the woods. This story happened about 4 months ago, and I swear, I am still completely freaked out. I don't expect you to believe my story because I can't even believe what I saw myself. Sometimes, I secretly still hope that what I saw was just a loose branch or some shadow, but I highly doubt it. I'm a 14-year-old male, and every year my family and I go skiing somewhere in the mountains. Usually we stay for about a week with our camper on a campsite. The campsite is only a few minutes away from the gondola that we use to ride up to the top. I know the area very well. We've been skiing there since 2013, so for about 5 years now. Every year there's a big party and concert at the mountain, at one of the gondolas. The party falls on the week that we always visit. The party is always in the evening, and on this day, you can go skiing until midnight. Usually the slopes will close at 7 in the evening. My brother, sister and I always love this night because skiing in complete darkness is totally epic. So like every year, we grabbed our skis and snowboards and headed up to the gondola station at around 9 o'clock, 2 hours before the concert started, so that we would have time to go night skiing. I actually had a snowboard accident only a few days before, so I couldn't snowboard for long periods of time without my knees hurting like crazy. So my parents, siblings and I head up to the station with the gondolas. It's already dark outside, but still light enough to see something. I remember rubbing my knees and hoping that I could enjoy the night without too much pain. Up by the station, many people were already gathered, around 200 to 300, and some bands were already playing on the big stage. My siblings and I started to head down the slopes. I was on my snowboard, and my brother and sister were on their skis. My parents were listening to the bands while drinking some beer. They didn't plan to go skiing that night. We were skiing for about an hour and a half, and more people gathered by the stage. My siblings and I took the lifts up one last time to be there for the start of the concert. Half hour into the concert, I noticed my knees were hurting a lot, how tired I was and how I was freezing. My parents offered me to take the gondolas back down to their campsite and get a good night's rest. I agreed. My parents and siblings stayed up on the mountain because the concert was still a few hours long and it had only just started. So I grabbed my board and stepped into the gondola that would take me back down to the valley. The trip down to the valley with the gondola took about 20 minutes. There were not very many people on them, because most people were still up there enjoying the concert. I got out my phone and started playing some random stupid game. But after about 15 minutes, I heard a loud thud from the gondola behind me. I looked up at my phone and was completely confused, because I was sure that no one had gotten in behind me. I turned around and squinted into the darkness, and could see the gondolas behind me and in front of me, still very clearly. I had no idea where the thud came from, and what it was, until I looked at the bottom of the gondola. There was a creature hanging on the bottom. I could only see the outline, so I wasn't even sure if it was an animal or a person. I stood on the top of the bench in the small gondola and opened the window on the side of the doors to get a better look. I turned on my phone flashlight, and what I saw almost made me drop my phone. At first glance, it looked like a coyote, but at second glance, I noticed that I definitely wasn't looking at a coyote. The creature was as big as a Great Dane, was covered in grey-black fur, with patches missing. Its face was a strange contortment. The snout was way too long for a normal coyote, and the teeth were sticking out. Its eyes were yellow-reddish, and the creature was holding onto the gondola with its long, skinny arms. It had long-looking claws. I stumbled back and pressed myself against the glass window. I looked down, hoping that I would be in the valley very soon, but I had about 5 minutes left. I could already see the station, and I kept my eyes glued to the creature behind me on the other gondola. It stared right back at me and grinned. Not a kind of dog grin. You know, if they're panting, it sometimes looks like they're smiling. No, it was a full-on grin. Wide mouth, baring its teeth. It then started rocking back and forth, still holding on to the gondola. The entire gondola started to rock, and so did mine, and one's in front and behind me, because they're all attached to one long steel rope. At this point, my panic was escalating, and I tried to calm myself down before I got into a full-on anxiety attack. The creature then flung itself towards my gondola. I tried to grab the bottom of my gondola, and I was completely in shock when it jumped, because the gondolas are about 20 feet apart. I heard a long clang as the creature managed to grab the bottom of mine. The valley was only a few minutes away, and I had started to cry. I heard a loud pitched scream from under my gondola, and hovered in a ball on the bench. I was about a minute away from the valley, and at that point I heard the creature let go and drop to the ground, which was about 50 feet away, with a loud thump. I peered down and saw it sprinting away into the woods. After I got off the gondola, I could barely walk or speak. I made it back to the camper and locked every door and window, curled up into a ball, and cried until I fell asleep. I didn't go skiing the next day, and didn't tell anyone of what I saw, because I knew that nobody would believe me. After I came home and calmed down a bit, I did research as to what I had seen. I think I might have had an encounter with a yeti, or perhaps a skinwalker. I told my older brother what happened, and he doesn't completely believe me. But he told me that while he was skiing in the wood trails, he would often see tall creatures running around, but he wasn't sure if it was just his eyes playing tricks on him. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I'd like to thank everyone who has gone out and actually purchased the audiobook. It really means a lot to get all that support from you guys. I've seen a lot of you in the comments section saying you're already listening to it, which is great. But it's really strange because Audible is saying that it's had no sales, which is really weird. I don't know, maybe it's delayed. Anyway, it's great to hear that you're enjoying it. Something that's incredibly important is that when you're done, please leave a review on Audible so that other people can be encouraged to listen by your thoughts. So yeah, it would really mean a lot if you guys could do that after you've listened. Thank you. And you know, if you haven't yet and you'd like to listen, I'll leave a link in the description. It's really good. I think you guys will like it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed tonight's bumper edition of Skinwalker, Wendigo and Cryptid stories. I think this could have been one of my favourites so far. Honestly, the recording was almost an hour and a half long. You know, it's obviously been trimmed down now, but it was a lot of fun to narrate. It's almost double the time I spent on regular narration, actually. But anyway, I hope that you guys liked it. If you did, please drop a like and leave a comment. That means a lot to me. I'd love to see your feedback and what you thought of the video. So thank you. If there's a story that you would like to share with me, feel free to send it to my email or my Reddit, and it should hopefully be coming in a future video. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.